We acknowledge that the land the Go Open Data Association is webcasting from is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto was built on sacred land that is part of an agreement between Indigenous peoples and extended to allied nations to peacefully and respectfully care for it.
Go Open Data. This is Mission Control. You are go for lunch.
Take some time away from your office bay to the Good Cafe. Open Data, go Open Data, Open Data, go Open Data. We meet up virtually. All our beverages are free for Open Data coffee. Open Data, go Open Data, Open Data, go Open Data, Open Data, go Open Data. Welcome to the Good Cafe.
Indeed. Welcome, everybody. It's May the 10th. It's a Tuesday, and that means it's time for the Good Cafe. And we've got some interesting things, I think, to talk about today. I'm Keith McDonald, by the way, Director of Communications from the Go Open Data Association. And my guest today is Christina McGirr. I love the handle, by the way, Christina. And we're going to talk about a lot of things that relate to, just so many things, I think. I want to introduce Christina, though, formally. Christina's been an active part of the Civic tech community in both her hometown of Calgary and current home base in Toronto. I don't know if that gives you any conflict with the Maple Leafs and the Calgary Flames. Still early in her career, she has a unique, multifaceted experience in marketing and technology. She currently leads marketing for the digital management and analytics community at Public Sector Network, and her interests include using data for public good and how data can be used to empower communities and people. So let's bring you into the picture here. There we are. We got the two of shot together. So Christina, welcome. How are you?
Thank you so much,
today?
Keith.
Yeah, it's so nice to have you here. I wanted to let people know where we actually met up because we're going to talk about LinkedIn right away. But actually, your LinkedIn page is very interesting because you talk about how can I help you around issues such as marketing. So that piqued my interest in particular. And it seems too you sent out an invite to me because we actually met up at Civic Tech about a year and a half, 2 years before connecting on LinkedIn, I think. So it was a bit of a roundabout way of connecting, but the first conversation that we had, I think, was great. We talked about all kinds of things, but we started out talking about social media in particular because we found at Good that although people seemingly see posts, they aren't really actioning the posts. And we have 22 people with us today, if I'm reading the participant count. Actually, it's a little less than that. We had 22 people signed up in total. And there's 14 of you out there, so welcome, folks. And if you do have any questions, please enter them in the chat, and we'll certainly bring you into the conversation. But initially, if we're talking about LinkedIn and social media, my complaint was it's like bringing the horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? So we get people coming to, you can see that there's views, but actually then registering or going off to the link, there was some resistance to that, or just, they just didn't go, right? So I remember you providing us with some suggestions about how you can ramp up some of our posts. And your suggestions did work for our conference just passed. We got a lot more views. I'm still not sure that we got the actual action, though, which to me is a bit of a flaw on just social media in general. And so I thought we could resurrect a bit of that conversation and talk about your experiences with that, because you really do spend a lot of time on LinkedIn with the public sector group that you're involved in. And I think your suggestions were so right on in the sense of drawing more attention to it. And your post in particular for this event, I thought was really great. So I'm just going to read it as I think an example from what you were telling us, because this is something that I saw, and obviously I was interested because it's our event. But when I read it, I thought, yeah, I see what you're really saying to us about how you can make a compelling thing. So this was you posting 2 days ago, I believe. What does your declining post reach on social media have to do with why it's so hard to file your taxes? Which is a nice curve, right? Should we fill the government with scrappy startups, or has big tech become government? This should be a punchy and insightful chat with Keith McDonald that cuts through a lot of the noise, nonsense, and narratives about tech, data, marketing, and the government. I hope you'll be able to join us tomorrow for a half-hour discussion. Actually, we do 3/4 of an hour. And you can register and so on. Go Out Data always puts up together really insightful events, so be sure to check out their other events as well. So I want to flatter you for that, but what is your reaction then to people who, like me, are feeling depressed about it, that it's just not working well enough? Are my expectations too high?
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't say the expectations are too high, but you just have to take a very, like, my advice to people is to take a very realistic perspective at it, which is that, you know, whether you're working with the government, for example, filing your taxes, or you are working with LinkedIn, you're working with an entity, and that entity has its own goals. And those goals may or not be aligned with yours, right? They could be, they could not be. It depends on what you're doing on the platform. So when you look at a platform like LinkedIn or pretty much any other social network, LinkedIn's my specialty. I definitely was involved in LinkedIn too much, even before my work at public sector. I happen to like it, and during COVID, it, you know, is an outlet to meet other people. But you know, something like LinkedIn, you know, when it's a private entity, it's a social media. What they're looking at is, you know, their valuations are based on a metric called monthly active users, right? You saw what happened with Meta most recently when their monthly active user base declined. So did their stock price. And right now they're in a hiring freeze. And so, you know, that success of that company is very much tied to that metric. So that's all great and theoretical, but how does that actually tie back to what you're doing on the platform? Well, you have to understand where your incentives align with theirs. So what that means is that post that I put up, it actually gets strangled by LinkedIn. I mean, this is not an official endorsement, but you know, when I look at the performance of that post in comparison to other posts that I put up on the platform, its reach is not as far. And one of the reasons for that is because my post is directing people off of the website. I'm asking people, hey, interrupt your scrolling on LinkedIn, click on this link and go to another website. And that's not really what they want. What they want is they want people to stay on the feed. They want people to keep consuming on the feed and continue that cycle, so that, because the more hours that people spend on a feed, the more opportunities there are to give ad space. And so more ad space, more revenue, more monthly active users. In general, all of those things are towards their strategic function. So, okay, that's great. We understand them. Now, how do you change what you do to kind of capitalize on that? Well, the first thing that you do is you optimize for in-feed consumption. So you make the assumption that in general, the posts that will perform the best and kind of give you what we call in advertising that reach beyond your own just initial network and even to your own network. Those posts are going to be different than the posts that are going to give you that action. And so, you know, we talk, you know, not to get too deep into marketing theory, but we talk about kind of the top of the funnel and we talk about the bottom of the funnel. People come in, you want to fill up the top of the funnel because, you know, they need to know about what you do and what you are before they can get to the point where they say, I want to sign up for a Go Open Data event, right? So, you know, top of the funnel is I understand what Go Open Data is. I understand what they do. I'm familiar with them. I trust them. Bottom of the funnel is, you know, it's worthwhile for me to go to this event. So those metrics are going to be different, and your content strategy should be optimized to kind of take advantage of those. And so, you know, this can also apply, you know, for the public sector in that context, in terms of, you know, understanding what your, you know, what your communication target should be on a platform like LinkedIn. You know, is it to get people to sign up for something? Because that might not be the best communication tactic. Whereas if it's to let people know about, you know, like, for example, park closure or traffic thing, or an improvement or a new project or something like this, you know, that's more likely to have better reach on the platform. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, this is so fascinating to me because, and again, this, by the way, for our audience, it's not unique to Go Open Data. I'm sure if you folks are on platforms and trying the same kinds of things, perhaps you're discovering the same issues. I think what I find most interesting there too about this idea of taking them off the platform, how that's really anti what the platforms want, right? I mean, that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. I've become really cynical, I guess, with all of social media because of algorithms and how so many things come up and they go. And you know, even people that you're following, you often don't see what they're posting because there's other stuff that you don't really want, paid ads, um, suggested feeds and things like that. But that could possibly be my demographic. I think when we're looking at full scope audiences, from people just starting their careers out, those who are working in government, those who aren't working in government, which brings in what I want to talk about with civic tech folks. We all have slightly different interests, right? And different curves and different expectations. Um, so I think it is a challenge, any way you slice it. And I'm perhaps just need a break from it, maybe social media, right? So that's if anyone out there wants to take over the good social media feeds, come on in, because we are looking for support. But I want to pivot just a bit to talk a bit about the Civic Tech Group and so on, and your background in that. Started in Calgary, and then you've come into Toronto, and you've obviously continued to participate in Civic Tech. And in fact, you are recruiting talent to come in and talk at your Civic Tech meetings and so on. And you've been all virtual as well for the last couple of years. And how has that impacted you and your get-togethers? Because in previous Civic Tech world before COVID, you had large groups live, and your whole methodology was really interesting, very inclusive. So people would introduce themselves, have an opportunity to listen to somebody speak for the first 20 minutes or so, and then get into groups and start doing civic tech things, if you like. So how has that changed with COVID? And do you expect to pivot back to live in-person get-togethers?
So I just want to clarify before I say anything that one of the quintessential parts of civic tech for anyone who is, unfamiliar with what the organization does is that, we aren't in general we don't have the same level of structure and decision making as I would say traditional organizations do. And so what I mean by that is we intentionally design our events as well as our organizing and structure. I would, some people might call it anarchic, but I would not say we're anarchists. I would just say that we, like a lot of that is built with the understanding that people come and go in and out of the community based on, how life happens, right? And especially when you're talking about asking for, volunteer work and community building work from people, people have different abilities to kind of contribute at different parts in their life, right? So part of creating an inclusive culture and, being able to have everyone's voices at the table, which is, very important, a fundamental aspect of civic tech. We do have a structure that's built around that. So anything I say is not necessarily a reflection of the thing. I can posit my opinion, but it is my opinion. And with that out of the way, what I would say is that, out of all the civic tech groups in Canada, we've honestly had the most success with virtual, I would say. And I think a lot of that owes to the fact that we had a very, very robust community before we ended up getting hit by COVID. And we also had some very, very motivated organizers when we made the transition. So, what kind of happened was COVID hit, and we had a small group of organizers who really led the charge in trying to make sure and to migrate that model virtual and make sure that it was an experience that was able to engage people. So, one of the things that you mentioned, introductions, we still do them. Some people might think that sounds like the most painful experience ever, to log on to a Zoom call and listen to 20 different people tell you about their dog or their cat or their pet. But, on the other hand, I might say that the side conversations about people's, kids that run in the screen and, random noises in the background have been some of the most connecting experiences that I've had with virtual meetings, both professionally and, in civic tech, it is a semi-professional community. So, those kind of spaces allow people to make and to continue those connections in a less kind of sterile environment. So, that is one of the things. And then the second thing I would say is that decentralization aspect. We do have a very active online Slack channel where people are able to kind of build projects, make space for projects, and update people. And so because we had a lot of that pre-existing knowledge about how to use tools like Slack, that jump was a little bit easier to make for a larger portion of our community. So with the caveat there that I understand that Slack can be a bit overwhelming, and we have gotten feedback from people that Slack can be quite overwhelming tool to use if you're not used to it.
When Slack first came out, I was still working for the city of Toronto, and I said, if everybody here starts using Slack, we'll all be a bunch of slackers. Which again is, playing on the idea that sometimes government workers aren't the most robust of workers. But that does segue into actually what I wanted to talk about is your experience then in dealing with your efforts. And civic, I think, is a very big word in your title there, civic tech. Yeah, what are some of your experiences in dealing with government folks, be it with some of the challenges that cities are facing and how you feel you can help? And what has the response been generally? I mean, do you feel there's enough collaboration?
Yeah, so I mean, what I would say is like I want to step back a little and add a few lenses to this discussion, right? The first thing to understand is that I am from Calgary originally. I studied entrepreneurship and I was ready to go right into the tech scene. That was the rocket ship path that was laid out. But I quickly found that didn't necessarily resonate with my interests, which were closer to public service and policy and understanding some of these very complex ideas around how do you build a government and a system that actually works, because it is it is a wicked problem, as people like to say in the design space. And so given those, as well as a lens from civic tech, it has this wonderful blend. It has this blend of people taking initiative and building projects on their own, kind of rolling up their sleeves and just getting the job done, testing it out, seeing how it works. But on top of that, we have a lot of people in the community that are from the government. And I would say that especially a lot of these people that work, there doing service design, they have this in-depth understanding of inclusivity that just isn't an understanding in the tech community right now or in general. So, one of the events that we recently had around digital government for the company that I work for was around, we had this quote about accessibility and inclusivity. And, one of our speakers, what she said was that, the 80-20 rule doesn't cut it in government, right? You can't design a service that only 80% works 80% of the time for 80% of the people. When you're targeting, growth, right? There's often very profitable kind of at the margins, the long end of the tail, right? That's what the internet has enabled. But the government needs to service everyone. Every single person needs to be able to log on and use a service. And so for that reasons, the ways that things are created is just fundamentally a different process, right? Those discussions about inclusion have to be part of the discussion from the get-go. There needs to be an understanding there of where people are at and having more voices on the table that just isn't a part of Silicon Valley culture. And so in terms of what talking about like kind of collaboration between civic tech groups and the city, I would say that I'm less close to the direct discussions that have happened between some of the projects, but I would say that there is a very friendly relationship there. I would say we've had a lot of people from the city, especially City of Toronto, come to civic tech specifically to be able to hear the ideas and to hear the insights. And to get a little bit more in-depth knowledge in terms of what those projects are like, and what's going on and what people actually want. So I know you might, I know that not every project that Civic Tech has come up with has been wholly successful in getting adopted by the government or another structure. But one thing that I would point out is that I think that I think some of that tension is healthy, I guess, in the sense of, cities can't always just adopt something all the time, right? It's just not necessarily a possibility. It's in order to, so if you were to take an open source project, okay, you wanted to build, some kind of program that does task A, and you were to take that and you were to implement it into a system, all of a sudden, that task has to be integrated into everything else that system is doing. And for example, the interface to do task A needs to hit all of the accessibility criteria. It needs to hit all of the inclusivity criteria, and it needs to hit all of the other check marks internally. And if anyone has attempted to do a project within the public service, they understand that there are a lot of check marks. And then on top of that, there's also the requirement for that system to be maintained, right? And so in order for that system to be maintained and guaranteed in a way that it can be usable for everyone in perpetuity, requires talent. And I mean talent in the sense of people who have the technical know-how to maintain that system. And so that also will be a substantial barrier. So I know I'm probably not saying anything that's brand new here, but you know, part of it is under that. I would say that's my perspective on it, is that there's complexity there.
Yeah, complexity to be sure. I mean, I think you're really saying there's been some evolution to what I would be familiar with when I was active. I left in 2016, and around, let's say, when all the apps started to come in with the iPhone being developed, et cetera, some of what you were talking about wasn't really followed by the government at that time in regards to accessibility. I mean, so many apps and stuff that the city were using just on their own website was only viewable on Internet Explorer. That's a historical fact. Now that's changed quite a bit, obviously, because there's been just more use of other browsers and the flaws in Internet Explorer became obvious and so on. But I do think the goals were absolutely correct by government. They're talking about all of that. But again, in actual practice, sometimes it doesn't happen that way. But there's, I even want to use the word tensions, I think, between an outside person trying to develop something for the city regards to some of those criteria. There's a lot of, I mean, the joke used to be if the city developed their own app, it would have like 15 pages of information that you have to click on before you actually start using the app. And a lot of the tech people were saying, why does it have to be that way? So there is a bit of a, I think what you're saying is a maturity, I think, from both sides to recognize how it flies with a user. And you can't inundate them with too much bureaucratic writing and stuff like that. So a lot of the things I've seen more recently that the city is developing, even their use of Instagram, I've noticed there's a guy who's dealing with solid waste issues on Instagram. And it's great. It's really personable. And I think it's an example of the growth of cities for sure. But, you know, the residue of some of that attitude, I think, it used to be there really wasn't app developers in the cities at all. And now they are starting to hire app developers and talent. But there is a bit of a chip on the shoulder sometimes, which is, well, we're from the city, we fully understand the situation. So therefore, we're the only ones who can do this. In the early days of open data even, there was such a huge demand for TTC data, for example. And the TCC at the time was refusing to release it. Why? Because they were going to be developing apps, which weren't forthcoming. So finally, we were able to get them to release that data. And sure enough, a lot of things started to be developed. And now the TTC itself has got some great activities going. So that's a tension, though, that I'm talking about, right? I think we see an outside talented group of people who clearly see an avenue to do something that will actually improve. And I'm not sure if Civic Tech in Toronto has dealt with the parks and recreation issues, for example, registration, and all of the stuff that still is very complicated, where people are literally, you know, getting their relatives to wake up at 6 a.m. and be on the phone, and they've got a workforce of 18 people trying to register. Surely there's a better way to resolve that. And that's been going on for years and years and years. It reminds me of TIFF, the Toronto Festival, had issues about people trying to buy tickets and right, that things were failing, and they had to resolve that. It's a world-renowned festival, and you can't have those kind of difficulties. Yet when it comes to the city, you still can't resolve the Parks and Rec issue. So my question to you around that is how hard do you feel you need to push to get through, or is it worth pushing, or do you just kind of let it ride a little bit and move on to other projects? I mean, the challenges you face, realistically, what are they?
I mean, I think the real question there, Keith, is how does change happen in government, right? Like that's really what you're getting at, because you know, you're talking about tension external, and I think we both kind of gotten to the point where we've said, you know, a lot of changes have happened as a result of that external tension, right? As a result of people pushing, things move. You know, and I think we have to also understand that there's, you know, that macrocosm is also a microcosm within the government, right? Like there are so many incredibly dedicated public servants that I have seen who are working tirelessly to advocate for more inclusive, more accessible and easier to use government services, right? And who are also advocating for open data and for people to be able to access, you know, our own data, right? There are so many people who are working on that. But at the same time, decision-making within the government is not always the speediest, to say it lightly. But I do think there's a useful model to understand, which is, you know, I'm going to use the Samsung and I'm going to use iPhone, right? So, you know, for those of you who aren't aware, Samsung does not make a lot of money off its phones. And you say, why on earth does Samsung have such a large part of the market share if they don't make a lot of money off their phones? Well, Samsung makes a lot of money off of selling phone components, and their primary customer is Apple. So why does Samsung release a flagship every year that is cutting edge and crazy expensive? Well, the reason why is because if they continually push the button on this kind of technology, it then adds forces for Apple to compete and therefore keep buying their top of the line phone components, which they actually make money on. So, you know, you look at something like that where it is tension, it is competition, it is friction, right? And if you apply that in a similar context to the government, it's obviously not the same. We're talking private versus public, but there is a similar dynamic there, right? You know, when a civic tech group goes and they build an app, right, and they show that this can be done. You know, we can have a map of every public washroom in Toronto. We can have a map of every bike parking spot. What it does is it puts pressure, right? It puts pressure on the city to say, you know, why aren't you doing this, right? Like, how can we integrate that? You know, and it doesn't always happen as fast as we'd like. I totally get that. But that tension is good. That tension is what moves us there. And I absolutely, for anybody who has a project where they're trying to get that buy-in and to get that, I would say, how long should we fight? Forever, until it happens. And I know that sounds exhausting. You should pace yourself, avoid burnout, you know, pick up other hobbies. But, you know, at the same time, right, I think we have a cultural bias towards the immediate, the instant. And I would say that, you know, if you were to look at a broader view of history, that the immediate and the instant is not frequently how changes are made. You know, in some cases they are, but in a lot more cases, it takes, you know, somebody sometimes dedicating their entire life to that one moment that seems like an instant to you.
I'm smiling because I'm thinking of the web content management issue that I was directly involved with in the city, and it took a long time to come into play. In fact, a condo building was built outside our offices. One of our staff had 2 children, and she said, "That's it. I'm not having any more before this is done." And I used to say I want it to come into place before I die, and thankfully it did, because I'm still alive. But it does take a long time. I agree with you. I'm an impatient person, and I think a lot of our taxpayers are very impatient. It's just, why does it have to take so long? And to me, that's a cultural behavior issue that's been it's immutable in government for some reason. And I do see often the tech people I've met are impatient as well, because they can, you know, literally take out their laptop and develop something. And this happened, a real anecdote for you. Our first intern that we ever hired in IT as a young guy named Derek, and first meeting he attended, first day on his internship, we were having some discussion, and he took out his laptop and he started crunching some numbers, and he flipped it around and showed us. He said, "Well, and you know, I thought, great, we hired the right guy for one thing. But it was a really stunning example, I think, of immediacy of tools, being aware of the current tools, especially, that do wonderful things in terms of analytics. And it was a real kick in the butt, I think, to that group that, you know, gee, there might be something to this tech community out there that are aware and on top of it and have a skill set. And then when you actually get them there, in other words, when you mention they're coming to meetings, so City of Toronto people or whoever, starting to meet and mingle, that really is helpful. So I think those are interesting insights. And speaking of civic tech, though, I don't want to give the impression it's just unique to Toronto or Calgary, right? It is in a lot of places. Would you say it goes far as to say it's everywhere, like certainly in major cities, or how far afield does a tech group?
I mean, I would say the civic tech movement is global, definitely. We've had people call into our civic tech Toronto meetings, even from Japan. So it is a global phenomenon. We have several civic tech groups across Canada. And, so if you're not in Toronto or Calgary, if you're in those, I encourage you to join those groups as well. But, we also have in Vancouver, in Fredericton, in Montreal, and in Ottawa. And so, please do. This is not a sales pitch, but it is a wonderful group of people. I would say it's the right balance between optimism and willingness to do things. So, and yes, I can absolutely share. We can share links to the group, to group pages in the to Zoom chat as well to answer your question. But
yeah. Please do. So yeah, I would agree. I'd say there is value, and we found it is true in open data as well, right? Getting those who have the data to come and mingle with those who want to use the data outside of the government was wonderful. The energy and the likability, I think, of the folks generally, and it worked both ways, was really remarkable. So as a suggestion, certainly from past practice, if you in your community can get that kind of synergy happening, it's great. And I would also say knowing of groups that you can bring in, so from the government standpoint, is a good thing, right? So use those groups because they're more than willing. Which leads me to a next question. If someone wanted to start a group and they weren't necessarily tech, perhaps they are from the government and they would want to start some kind of, I don't know, focus group or, board that, kind of is current towards stuff that they could advisory boards, those kind of things. What is the best way to go about that? Do you have to be a techie to start one, or what would you do to get started?
I cannot stress enough that tech needs to be a language for everyone. So we to go back to that conversation that we just had about how does change happen, right? You can't just have somebody who knows the tools, right? If somebody knows the tools but they're unable to do everything else that's required for change, then change doesn't happen. So, when you look at successful movements, you look at successful projects, you're always going to look at a group of people that have put this together. There's almost always, I should say, more than one. Occasionally there's the one in a million who understands the entire picture and has the entire skill set. But, most of these changes we can't hold our breath for that person to emerge, right? We need to look at how can we work together to make these things happen. So, you want a technological change to happen. There's some amazing mentorship programs within the government where senior leaders are taking on more junior people and teaching them, this is how change happens. These are the people you need to kind of, get on side. You need to get buy-in from these different people. Here's how you do it. Here's the process. Here's how you navigate this. And that's setting up, I think, a younger generation of leaders within the public sector to be able to make some of these changes. And so similarly, I would say that, if you're intent on, changing something, whatever that particular thing is that you're really passionate about, the first thing is if it's civic tech related, which I know is a very broad field, but if it is related to benefiting our community as a whole, then I would encourage you to come to Civic Tech. And we have a session, we have like a part of our meeting called Pitches. And that's reserved for anyone and everyone to come take the floor and to bring forward an idea or a topic that they want to discuss. So, this could just be, I'm really bothered by this. What can we do about it? It could be you have an idea for a project already. I'd like to build an app to do this particular thing. Bring those to this and pitch and see, because we have a lot of people who have a lot of experience in doing some of these projects. And we have a lot of people who have a very wide breadth of experience. So some of our most successful projects haven't necessarily been led by people who have purely technical focus. Frequently, we also need people who come from a policy side, as well as people who, have the other traits that keep teams going, right? Leadership qualities, communication skills, all of these other, as we like to call them, soft skills, although I think they might be the hardest skills to really master. So tech is for everyone. You can make a change, right? Like you have the capacity. And I would encourage you that if this is something that you want to do, that the best way to make it happen is to find other people that are interested in making it happen. because then those conversations could start, and then we can sort of build a coalition. We can build a project. We can test the project. We can improve the project. All of those things start there. So
you mentioned someone from Japan coming in. I mean, would it be something that, let's say, I don't know, Windsor wanted to do something and they were to attend a Civic Tech Toronto? Is that feasible and have a discussion that way?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We have welcomed people from all over. So, one of the benefits of going virtual is that we've become a lot more accessible for people geographically. And so previously, when we were in person, we used to only meet within specific boundaries of the downtown Toronto core to try to make sure that we were, the compromise of accessibility, because at least everybody can get downtown, hopefully. But it is more or less feasible for people to get downtown. If you live on the furthest reaches of Scarborough, it's a very long haul. So I think we found a lot more people have kind of popped up from different parts of the city, which has been wonderful. It's been a wonderful addition to our community. And that's why the conversation of are we going back to in person becomes a lot more complicated, because our community has changed fundamentally because of the format change.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. In fact, I think the best of both worlds would be the best way to go. In other words, you are live, but you've also got a capacity to deliver virtually. And in fact, in our hackathon, Jonathan Brown, our Director of Education, actually incorporated some of that in the first parts of the hackathon, where he was in a community center and they had a 2-camera setup, and there were live people plus the virtual people. People might say, well, what about the expense of that? But, everything is getting a lot cheaper than it used to be. If we were talking in 1980 to do this kind of thing, it was almost prohibitive, huge cameras, right? They were really expensive. And now, in essence, you can buy something with using your iPhones with a little switcher and stuff like that. And I think Good is interested in exploring that for our future conferences, simply because we see the value of having the virtual access, for sure, just what you said. I think it's something that anybody who's into this, be it the government too, right? If they're going to do town halls, and this has long been asked for, right? I can't make it to your town hall live at your civic center. Perhaps there's a way to give you my message. And hopefully that will grow as well, because governments were also faced with the same issues that we all were over the last couple of years. So they had to make an investment in technology to some degree to be able to have meetings with staff and so on. I think you're quite right, though. How are we going to get back to that? And are we even comfortable? I was reading on LinkedIn this morning from a fellow that I follow, and he's got his first live session in 2.5 years, and he's writing, I don't even know if I can know how to socialize anymore. Do I extend my hand to shake hands, or what are people going to feel? Do we wear masks? Do we not wear masks? I mean, I think we're going through a transition again that is going to make it interesting to see how we do socialize live versus Zoom. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, at Public Sector Network, it's one of the, it's an essential question to us. So one of the ways that we've handled that is we do virtual and in person. So, that's great. But with our in-person events, one of the things that we implemented that we got a lot of positive feedback on is that we actually color code people's badges. So, when you come into the event, you have the ability to pick a sticker, red, yellow, green, that indicates your comfort level. And so, green is I'm all in, hugs, everything, like I'm back to it. And red is please give me space, 6 feet away, etc. And yellow is kind of an in between, like, I'm not shaking hands, but can do a little elbow bump. I'm still around. So, we found that has helped people a lot, because, when you come back into person, and I mean, there are literally people, social scientists are having a heyday measuring how difficult people are finding this transition back, because people are, turns out being out of practice for 2 years, socially awkward. So people are actually, it's not your imagination. It is more difficult. And, add an extra layer on top of that of trying to negotiate this net new scenario each time you see somebody, that is very nerve-wracking. So that is one thing we've adopted that has had some success.
I like that. It reminds me of like school dances, grade 7 and 8 or whatever, right? I'm going to sit in the corner versus someone who's all in, as you say. Yeah, that's a really good suggestion, I think. We've got about 5 minutes to go. Just reading some comments to see if we had any questions. Reminder, we can still take at least one question if you like from the audience. I was socially awkward beforehand. This levels the playing field. That's a great comment. Yeah, I do think even how tech has, I think there was always an awareness of tech, but I think through COVID, there was a lot more awareness, I think, because people maybe even had more time, if you like, to explore their applications. And it wasn't all just, Instagram and everything else, right? There were a number of tools that were coming out, one of which was the exposure app. And I wanted to mention that because that really didn't take off, did it? People may have downloaded it. There were different versions of it in the creation of it. I can remember the open data community was quite active in the early stages, discussing how they might be able to assist. I'm sure Civic Tech was also engaged, but it flopped. And I don't know why. Was it just people were reluctant to use it? Any thoughts on that and how tech and health may or may not be well received?
I mean, I think in all honesty, I believe I just saw Bianca from Civic Tech Toronto also do a wonderful kind of deep dive on the app and why it should be sunsetted and, a few of those kind of complications there. What I would say is that it's very difficult. Like, I know it's easy to build an app, easy, but it's actually really difficult to build a good app. It's very difficult to build something that people want to use. And on top of that, when we talk about what people's comforts levels are with data, we can very clearly see that people's comfort levels are trending away from sharing data, right? There was, some political news about data being shared in the US that could potentially, target people based on, political affiliations and that those data sets were being sold. And so, the CEO of that particular company had come out and said, thanks for showing us. And now we've removed them. But, there is a real concern, right? Like, the tech culture is move fast and break things, right? And that is great when speed is what you're optimizing towards. But what you have to understand is that, when we do these sudden shifts like to virtual, every time you make a massive move, you leave people behind. And so in all the ways that, virtual has actually, opened up things to be more accessible in some ways, it has also made it less accessible for other people. And, in the way that accessibility works frequently, when people aren't, when things aren't accessible, people become less visible. And so it almost is like a self-fulfilling prophecy when things are less accessible, that it's less visible that they aren't accessible. So, I think that kind of needs to be understood in this discussion of like where, tech and government and where are we going, with an exposure app, that was rolled out, right? And it was rolled out very quickly. And I think people, had skepticism about it, about how well it worked, about whether their data would be safe. And if anybody who did use it went to a testing facility because they got an alert, they would find out that they immediately got an alert following their visit to the testing facility. So, I don't want to get into the weeds here because, there's a lot of discussions around, what the actual data methodology was used in that app versus other data methodologies that might be more secure or less secure. Because I think a lot of that is too in the weeds to really reflect public sentiment, which is just that people didn't understand it and they didn't necessarily trust it. And unfortunately, it didn't get the adoption that it would need to really truly be effective as an app. And so the network effects were working against the app. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. And that, I think, raises the idea then of back to not just civic tech folks and city government folks working together. It's the outreach then to the community at large who's going to benefit from the cooperation between the two groups. And sometimes you can get into the weeds and your discussion is beyond, let's say, the interest of a public group. And you do have to back to communicating, right, in terms of how people might understand it so that they would be interested in it, which really goes back to where we started with how you might communicate on LinkedIn. So actually, we've hit the 1 o'clock time. I did want to just add a few pieces of information about us in particular, because why not? Right? Let's promote our LinkedIn page. We're at LinkedIn company/go-open data. You can find us there. We'd love you to follow us and engage in some of our discussions. We're going to try and do some blogging, or I guess we call it LinkedIn posting there, to provide some content and hopefully get some exchanges going on with folks. And also, we do tape the cafe and put it on our YouTube channel. And unfortunately, we haven't got enough subscribers yet to get a specific address, like youtube.com/go-open-data. So you may say, well, it's hard to find you. But actually, if you go to our website, we have a direct link to the YouTube channel. And you can find all kinds of content there. And we're planning to do a lot more live streaming there as well. So those are 2 bits of promo that I wanted to put in. And you can reach us, by the way, at connect@go-opendata.ca, just for your edification. And you have added to the chat where you can go to find if there's a Civic Tech group. Would you want to add just a link to Civic Tech Toronto specifically, or to your YouTube page, or anything before we go?
I definitely can.
Okay.
We will be meeting tomorrow, so you can put it right into play if you want to check it out.
Yeah, and I think it's great having this discussion. I think we could go on forever as our off live calls have gone. There's so many more things that we could talk about. And I really value your expertise on so many levels, being a person who's well-versed in civic tech community, as well as your marketing expertise. I think your suggestions are really helpful to us, and hopefully anybody listening as well would pick up on that. And basically, if we had to summarize in terms of that, social media, I think the biggest thing for me is this idea of they don't want you to leave the platform. So try and make it possible to stay on the platform and go that way, as opposed to trying to push them off too fast to a website. So a link to your website isn't going to do it. You've got to give a little bit more content. Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really about, we talk about this in marketing, but optimizing your channel, understanding, why people interact with you in a certain space, and just trying to be empathetic to that. So, and also understanding the platform, of course.
Great. Well, thanks again, Christina. Really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have you back for another cafe or some other forum, and continued success with Civic Tech, and of course your work with the public sector group as well. We'll just do a quick bunch of credits and then we'll end the meeting. It's a very quick bunch of credits. So thanks, and we'll see you again. In the meantime, folks, be good to each other. Thanks again, Christina. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me, Keith.